You're listening to Live from Lord North Street, a podcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today you'll hear an update from our Brexit Unit, led by the IEA's Chief Economist Julian Jessop. Julian and Digital Officer Madeline Grant give the latest updates from the negotiations currently underway in Brussels and discuss what sum, if any, Britain will be likely to pay in the so-called Brexit Bill. Julian goes through some of the sums and demands currently in play and examines what Britain may be owed in terms of EU assets. The pair also discuss the repercussions of the Prime Minister's recent speech in Florence, both in terms of the Brexit Bill and for the wider likelihood of reaching a trade deal before 2019. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to our podcast channel on iTunes, username IEA Conversations.
So Julian, Juncker's remarks earlier this month strongly implied that the EU side has essentially reached a stalemate on the financial side of negotiations. I think the exact metaphor that he used to describe Britain's position was of someone ordering a huge round of drinks in a bar and then dashing off without paying. Is it fair to say that negotiations have stalled on this particular issue?
Well, it's certainly one of the biggest sticking points, and I think it's always likely to be. There's nothing that focuses the mind as much as money does. But I think we are making a little bit of progress on this area. The Prime Minister, in her Florence speech, I think did make quite a reasonable opening offer for what the financial settlement might be. The EU is continuing to make some, I think, quite outrageous demands that are significantly higher than the EU could ever realistically expect to get back from us. But we are making some progress, and I think there are the bare bones of a deal that could be made by Christmas.
So what is the latest? Did the BM, she has made her opening offer, I understand it, but we're not quite sure what that figure could be. Can you shed any light on that?
Well, at this stage, it is very hard to put numbers on any of these potential offers because we don't yet know what the state of the budget is going to be in 2019 when we actually leave, or in 2020 when the current multi-year financial programme of the EU runs out. But in her Florence speech, the Prime Minister did effectively offer to continue paying EU contributions until the end of that current multi-year budget period, which takes us to the end of 2020. If we look at the sorts of numbers that our own Office for Budget Responsibility has penciled in over that period, that might mean a settlement of somewhere between 20 and 25 billion pounds to cover us over that period. As it happens, this might coincide with a 2-year transition period where the UK continues to enjoy the rights and also, of course, accepts the obligations of membership of the single market and customs union. So there is a certain double logic to it. It not only covers our contribution until the end of the current multi-year budget period, but it also would be a gesture to continue paying in while we're benefiting from some sort of transition period.
But yet the EU is clearly still asking for more. Can you please talk me through a little bit about some of the sums of money that have been suggested and what those responsibilities would entail?
Well, I think there are two big areas on top of the 20 billion or so that the EU wants us to pay up for. The first is that the EU wants the UK to continue contributing to spending that's already been committed in principle, but is actually unlikely to take place until well after 2020. So this is money that we will be continuing to pay a long time after we've left the European Union, and indeed probably a long time after any transition period as well. The sums of money there might come to another 20 billion or so. It's also been suggested that the UK makes an upfront payment for contingent liabilities. So, for example, if a borrower defaults on a loan to the European Investment Bank, then the UK might be liable for some of the money there. This could amount to another 10 to 20 billion. It would be money that we'd eventually get back if indeed the borrower doesn't default, which is going to be the case in the overwhelming majority of cases. But it still means an additional upfront payment that I think is very hard to justify now.
And would we at least be earning interest on those loans?
Yes, I think this is an example where we should be pragmatic. It has been suggested that we wouldn't get our contributions to the capital of the European Investment Bank back for potentially decades. I know this is a big concern for some people, but it is money that is earning a return. It is by and large invested in projects that are worthwhile. So I think it would make sense to leave that money with the European Investment Bank. I think that would be a useful goodwill gesture and simply get it back as and when the underlying loans mature. I think that's far more sensible than what the EU is proposing, which is that we make large upfront contributions now on the off chance that those loans default, quit our membership of the EIB completely and simply get the money back as and when those loans mature. That, again, doesn't really make much sense to me.
The narrative is that the EU wants us to pay an upfront bill in order to just get our bums on seats around the negotiating table. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think the The European Union position at the moment is not very clear. On the one hand, it wants us to agree a settlement on the money, but also things like the Northern Ireland border issues and on citizens' rights. Before we move on to other bigger things, actually are partly related to what we might want to pay in future. So, for example, it's very difficult to decide what our contributions over the next few years should be unless we know what the arrangements might be for trade between the UK and the EU. If, for example, we're continuing to benefit from our membership of the single market and the customs union in whatever form that might take, then perhaps it is fair to ask us to continue making some annual contribution. If, on the other hand, we're having a clean Brexit where we break ties completely in 2019, it's very unclear to me why we should be on the hook for a single penny more. We might want to make a few contributions for things like the pensions of EU officials, but beyond that, our obligations, I think, are essentially zero. And indeed, we should be getting a lot of money back for our contributions to things like the European Investment Bank.
So what about the EU's current assets that we've been contributing to since our membership began? Are we entitled to a share of those?
Well, the European Union itself doesn't actually have that many assets. Indeed, its net position is negative because it has lots of liabilities that are currently unfunded. If you simply look at the net asset position of the European Union, then it's actually in pretty bad shape.
Can you give me an example of what those liabilities look like in practice?
Well, the way that the European Union is run is that it makes very large promises to pay money to member countries in the future, which it doesn't currently have funding for. So it relies on members of the European Union making additional contributions at some point in time to pay for that spending. So if you look at the net asset position of the European Union at any point in time, it's actually running a big deficit. So if we were to say all that happens in 2019 is we split up the assets and the liabilities of the European Union, we'd actually end up in quite a bad position because we'd receive far more liabilities than we would actually assets. If you look at the few assets that the European Union does have, these are typically things like the assets of institutions like the European Investment Bank, which we could arguably get a share of back. But my view is that it would actually make more sense to keep our money in the European Investment Bank, to continue to receive a return, and then when the assets of the European Investment Bank mature, to get the money back then. So simply focusing on the assets and liabilities of the European Union actually doesn't deliver a significantly different result from looking at the annual cash flows. And those sorts of numbers, looking at the cash flows, do still suggest a divorce bill of somewhere between 20 and 30 billion if we continue to make those contributions till the end of 2020.
Is the EU still asking for more than that sum?
Oh yes, because the European Union is looking at additional payments well beyond 2020, and it's also making claims that we should pay contingent liabilities up front on the asset side as well. So I'm pretty certain that the EU would like to walk away with something nearer 60 billion than 20 billion. But a figure of 20 to 30 billion I think is a reasonable compromise. It's based on principles that I think most people would accept, and as long as we get something meaningful in return, then I think it's a deal that the Prime Minister could sell to the British public.
So back in June, when the IEA first launched the Brexit Unit, you argued at the time that the EU divorce bill should not exceed £26 billion. Do you still see this figure, or rough ballpark amount, as a realistic sum today? And would it potentially be worth paying more to get, for example, a thorough trade deal or a longer transition period?
Well, my starting point is still zero, or maybe even a net repayment of the assets that we have contributed to over the years. So when talking about any payment at all, we have to ask what is it that we're getting in return. Now, I personally think it would be quite reasonable to continue paying our annual contributions until the end of 2020. After all, that is money that we basically signed up to in 2013 or 2014 before the issue of leaving the European Union became live. So I think that's a reasonable contribution. What I balk at, though, is the idea of paying any money beyond that. I think the EU has to recognise that its second biggest net contributor is leaving. That's the UK, Germany being the biggest contributor. So it needs to start to adjust its spending beyond 2020 to reflect the fact that it's going to have less money than it would otherwise have done. I also think some of these demands around contingent liabilities are frankly ridiculous. I mean, no real business or financial institution would run its affairs like that. The EU has to be far more realistic than that. As to the idea of paying significantly more than 20 or 30 billion in return for a comprehensive free trade deal, again, I don't think that really makes sense. I mean, by and large, you don't pay to trade with somebody. You buy goods and services from one country, they buy goods and services from you. There isn't some sort of additional payment on top of that to allow that market to operate. So I think it makes no sense to continue paying simply for a comprehensive free trade deal.
But if that's a sum of money that you're paying where you would otherwise be potentially trading under WTO rules with tariffs, I mean, at that point, perhaps it does become a wiser investment, surely.
Well, that's actually quite a bad deal then, because the sums of money involved in the tariffs are actually quite small. I mean, the average EU tariff works out at about 5%. If you apply that to trade that we have with the EU, the total cost of that would come to a figure that is well below the 10 to 15 billion that we contribute every year at the moment. So even on that basis, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. And the whole point of trade, of course, is that both sides benefit. I mean, we're selling them goods and services. They're buying goods and services from us. That works both for us as a producer and then as a consumer, and vice versa. When we buy things from Europe, it's typically because they're cheaper or better, or some way we get some advantage from that. It doesn't seem clear to me that there's any reason for us to be paying additionally on top of the normal prices of those goods and services in order to benefit from that sort of trade.
Yes, that does seem to be something that's been often overlooked. I think it was the Dutch PM who said the EU might see itself jeopardising 15% of its trade in order to prove a point.
Absolutely. I think the direction we should be moving in is for lower barriers. That's both lower tariffs and also a reduction in non-tariff barriers. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me that we keep those barriers, or that the only reason that we get rid of them is because we're making some big side payment. After all, there are plenty of countries that do have free trade deals with each other which don't have any sort of payment of this type, nor do they have all this sort of overarching infrastructure that the European Union insists on as part of the single market. So the various freedoms of movement of people and capital and so on, or the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. I mean, by and large, the European Union makes these things far more complicated than they need to be. If the European Union produces things that we want to buy, or equally if we produce things that they want to buy, let people just get on with that. That's households, that's businesses. There's no need for governments to be involved with some sort of overarching structure of tariffs and barriers and payments to each other's budgets and so on. That doesn't make any sense at all to me.
Well, on that point, have you seen any signs so far that the EU is updating its budget and its habits and potentially the size of some of these structures to reflect the new reality where its second largest contributor is no longer contributing?
Well, there are first signs of a debate happening in Brussels, which I think is welcome. I think there is a recognition that not only is the UK leaving, as I say, the biggest net contributor after Germany, but also a recognition that a lot of this money is actually spent pretty badly. And there's no longer a case, even if the UK were remaining, for some of these projects going ahead. So there's a gradual recognition of the need to reform the budget. But it is also a grudging recognition. I do wonder whether this debate would have been happening if it not for the fact that the UK is leaving. And also, of course, there are a lot of vested interests here that very much want to keep this gravy train going. So there are some signs of progress, but I think it is going to be a very difficult battle to win. Ultimately, people like spending other people's money, and it's going to be very hard for that culture to change.
Speaking of a change of tone or perhaps of culture, do you think it's fair to say that May's Florence speech represented some kind of a turning point or even a softening of our negotiating position? On the face of it, at least, she did adopt a more conciliatory tone, offering legal enshrinement of EU citizens' rights and hinting at the acceptance of ECJ case law by British judges. Do you agree? And if so, what could this new approach mean for the size of the Brexit bill?
Well, I think it was a very helpful speech, and the response in the capitals and the rest of Europe was mostly very positive to it. I'm not sure there are any substantial concessions. If we take, for example, the divorce bill, the government, David Davis in particular, had always made it clear that we would be willing to look both at the letter of the law, but also the spirit of our future relationship with the European Union. So I think in that sense, offering to pay EU contributions until the end of the current budget period was simply putting some clarity around what was always likely to be the offer in any event. On the point of citizens' rights, and the British government has already made a number of offers that arguably the sorts of things it should be doing anyway, unilaterally, without waiting for the European Union to reciprocate. But I think it's pretty obvious if you talk to anybody in government that there's no intention to leave people who are here already from the rest of the European Union in a worse off position than they are now. So the question is, how generous would be the additional arrangements for those people arriving after a cut-off point, which may be as late as the date that we leave the European Union itself. So I think, again, that's putting some clarity around the sort of positions the government's been talking about for a while. The European Court of Justice issues, of course, are potentially far more difficult. I mean, a lot of people regard it as a red line that the European Court of Justice shouldn't have any involvement in the decisions of British courts. But it depends where you draw that line. It's always been a tradition of British courts to take account of decisions made by courts around much of the rest of the world. I mean, the precedents you can point to, British courts taking account of decisions of US courts, South African courts, Singaporean courts. It would be odd that they wouldn't take any account of decisions made by European courts, given the importance of European law in so much of our lives over the last few decades. What the government is saying it won't do, and I think this is absolutely right, is allow the European Court of Justice the final say in any decision affecting British citizens or the way we organise our economy and society. I think that red line remains in place. But it would be daft to pretend the European Court of Justice doesn't exist and that we haven't been paying any attention to EU law over the last several decades of our membership of the European Union.
Be sure to check out more blogs, podcasts, films, and reports from our website, iea.org.uk.